Welcome back to General Ecology, EFB 320. In this segment, we're moving into some really interesting series of lectures that are all dealing with species interactions beyond competition, right? I've already made my say. I've not made my piece, but I've made my say about competition. And in this segment for chapter 15, we're talking about parasitism and infectious disease. There is some modeling that goes on here. We'll see that in a minute. And if you've been doing anything in the world this year, we're in 2020, you know that there have been a lot of discussions about modeling of infectious disease. And you know that a lot of people don't get it. I'll come back to that later. So there is some modeling here, but mostly I want to, and the book does a pretty nice job of this. They could do better, but I want to hit on some very important wildlife diseases and sort of conservation issues that come up with parasitism and disease. And it's, I think as an ecologist, to not pay attention to the fact that some of the, say you're a tree ecologist, and you walk out in the forest and you see a conch, a shelf fungus on a tree, and you continue to do your work and you plant some plants in there to do your experiment. Well, if you're not paying attention to what species of conch that is, and you're looking at the gap and the great light that you're seeing in your forest, and you plant your seed and they all die, could it be that that fungus is in that stand? And anything you do about planting seedlings or seed is kind of a moot point because there's an infection court there and that fungus is underground as well as coming off the tree as a conch, and your experiment is completely thrown out because you didn't pay attention to the disease. So I want us all to be aware of disease, and you'll see plenty of good examples. I'm sure you're thinking of some right now that are very important and of major conservation, have major conservation impacts. So this first slide that I have up here for chapter 15 shows you two that you're very aware of. The white-nosed bat syndrome, that's a fungus on the tip of the nose of this poor little bat. Not all species of bats are as impacted by this fungus. It's a new fungus. There are various strains, and different strains have different levels of impact. We can look at that. It's in the book also a little bit. The middle picture is of some morbid, that is dead, frogs that have been hit by another fungus called chytridiomycosis that infects their skin and does a number on them. We'll look at that a little bit more. And then the picture on the right there is a cordyceps fungus. That was a moth that a friend of mine found near his research in the tropics, I want to say Guyana. He found that moth clinging to the branch or to a trunk of a tree with all those yellow things coming off. And if you look closely, you'll see that they're lined with sort of amber-colored dots. The fungus infected the moth. The moth went about its business for quite a while with the fungus growing inside. And then just before dying, the moth decided, you know, what I really want to do, even though I don't do this as a species, but right now I want to go fly as high as I can onto this tree, clasp onto the trunk, die. I don't think he was thinking that. Probably wasn't thinking much of anything. And the fungus then sporulates and bursts out of the body of this thing and then drops its spores. And if it's high enough, and it usually is because the behavior changes, it's dropping spores on other species of moth or other individuals that are in the area if there's a tight relationship between species. So anyway, we'll look at some of these storylines today. This image is it's kind of cute, I think, from the book. I think it opens a chapter. It shows you several different types of parasites. There's the mistletoe on the tree in the back. More than just one species, lots of different mistletoe. The plant, mistletoe, taps into the phloem of its host. Okay, so it's directly parasitizing the tree. It is green, so there may be some photosynthetic activity there in the mistletoe itself, but really it's getting its energy from the tree. And a little bit of mistletoe is probably not a huge thing, but when it starts to get loaded up like you see in that little cartoon, that tree's getting, its fitness is being reduced by the presence of that mistletoe. And then, of course, these others are ones that you're probably quite aware of. Ticks, especially in our area, are a big problem. Mites, lice, various kinds, fleas, and nematodes. Now, the interesting thing is that these ectoparasites, or endoparasites, if it's a nematode, aren't necessarily dramatically impacting the animals themselves, but they carry disease, right? The nematode is set. That actually is troublesome. But the flea is carrying things like bubonic plague. Larvae are annoying. Sorry, lice are annoying. I don't really know if they're carrying disease, but we do have a researcher here, Brian Ledette, and he can fill you in on that if you take his course on infectious disease. The tick obviously is carrying Lyme and other disease organisms, microorganisms, or bacteria, and the mite as well. So these are all parasites. They are probably more critical, for the most part, the little ones on mammals, more critical for the diseases that they carry. And I do want you to realize that it's not just the things that crawl around that are troublesome, it's the stuff they carry. And my last little point down there, where are the mosquitoes? There are more people in the world that die from mosquito-borne illnesses than sharks. So do we have any TV shows called Mosquito-nados? No, it's Sharknadoes. Because people see those sharks and they think, oh, my gosh, that's an ugly looking thing and it's really dangerous, and if I go swimming in the ocean, I may, less likely than if you were to get hit by a lightning strike. I don't want to poo-poo the idea that that's a problem. You have to be aware, but I've been in the ocean an awful lot. I've seen sharks while I was swimming. Never saw a really nasty looking one, but species are out there all the time. I know people that have died of mosquito-borne illnesses. Okay, so the fact that we are so blatantly willing to largely ignore them, except for what's in the news, and oh, malaria is a problem, is a problem. We have to be more cognizant and careful. Okay, so here is an interesting little water beetle from Dr. Weir's lab. And if you look closely, its back is lined with these little things up here. All those little things poking up. That's not part of its body. Those are little fungi. In a group of fungi called Labobiniales, they are ascomycetes, and we're still trying to figure out what the heck they do, but they're ubiquitous, they're everywhere. There seems to be some specificity with different species of insects that they infect or attach to. Whether they're commensal or parasitic or what they're actually doing, that is a little bit more mysterious. Here is also images from Weir's lab, and that's the whole organism, right? It's like 20 cells. A holdfast to get it onto the back of the insect, and then it's got male and female parts. And sorry, I don't remember which is which. Can't quite tell. This is another species of labule, also on some poor insect. I don't know, are those just annoying? Do the insects even know they're there? Is it like a barnacle on a whale? I don't know. I don't think, we know that in some cases they are probably reducing fitness of the animal, but in other cases we really just don't have a clue, and it may just be commensal. Again, Dr. Weir is the resident expert, so I should be careful with how much I'm saying here. It could be a little inaccurate. Okay, so these are Labobiniales on the backs of water beetles, and I've heard Dr. Weir say, much like something I've heard Dr. Perry say with his parasites, so to speak, but for every insect there is likely a fungal parasite or hitchhiker on that insect that's specific. In fact, Weir students have shown that there is even position specificity, that these labules will occur only on the underside of males and only on the backside of females on the right sides, so that when they copulate, that's when the sexually transmitted disease essentially is transferred. So there's some really interesting biology here, but largely out of sight, out of mind for most of us. Here's one that would be out of sight, out of mind unless you start paying attention. This little ant died, much like that moth in the earlier slide, and it too had a cordyceps, very specific to the ant species or related species group. And once the ant died, the fungus popped out of its body at the head, and then you're looking at the sporulating portion here of the fungus. And there's some just lovely images and, I don't know, cartoons, but you don't need a cartoon to see how awful this could be. The poor ant doesn't know, it's gone. But a parasite like this cordyceps, lives in or on another organism, and it eventually kills the host. There are two sort of general groups, the ectoparasites, like we've been talking about already, ticks, fleas, mistletoe, athlete's foot, a fungus on our bodies. And then there are the endoparasites like tapeworm and giardia, malaria, which is a plasmodium, and West Nile virus, which is a virus, but it does do a number. In fact, people die every year from West Nile virus. A pathogen, so the definitions get a little bit squishy and hard to define depending on if you're talking to a medical doctor or an ecologist or a pathologist, an entomologist, and bacteriologist, right? They all sort of have different viewpoints on what is a parasite and a pathogen. For me, a parasite is very small, could live in the host, and can kill the host, whereas a pathogen is quite a bit larger, will kill the host, and yeah, many are fatal, and they can cause what your book says is infectious disease. I think it's a fairly fluid set of definitions. In any case, both consume the host resources and reduced host fitness. If you look in your book or any number of books for definitions of those two organisms, by the way, you'll get frustrated because you don't get a solid, repeatable definition across the board. That's why I'm kind of having some issues here. But you don't need to worry about it. I think your book kind of hones in on calling everything a parasite, actually. So, sure, okay. The largest fungus, the largest organism in the world is a fungus. Is that a parasite on trees, or is that a pathogen on trees? Anyway, here's some more cordyceps. The one on the left is infecting an insect, a little ant or a bee. They tend to go underground. We're not going to go into the different names. You don't need to worry about that. Here's one in the middle there that's popping out of the eye sockets of this poor little larva. Again, a below-ground fungus attacking below-ground larvae. Here's another one, cordyceps, and it has nice little fluffy. Now these parts would be out above ground so that as other insects come into contact with these, they get infected. Same with these parts over here, this little guy here. Yeah, that is poking up out of the ground, and that's how it disperses. And even the one over on the left, one more, you can see that long stem and then the fungus up at the top is sporulating, and then that gets into the wind and infects the next probably colony of wasps or whatever. So these are all cordyceps. Very related to those are the claviceps. And on the far right, we have a claviceps purpurea on rye. This is a very famous fungus. You know it, you've heard of it. It has major cultural and sort of human impacts. For many, many years, people were eating infected rye, not knowing it, and they had a number of reactions if they ate enough of it. Their blood vessels would constrict. They might get gangrene on their arms and legs and extremities. They also would start to lose it in the head. So there's two things that are going on. One is it's impacting their circulation. The other, it's producing basically LSD. This is where we get LSD, from claviceps purpurea. And so St. Elmo's fire was the burning sensation of the claviceps causing gangrene. And St. Elm, I think, was a place where people could go to get some treatment. but it was horrible back in the 1600s and other, there's been other outbreaks, all because some people were being forced to eat bad rye grain. And then, of course, and then there was the Salem witch trials, which is probably largely a function of that fungus as well. So we'll leave it there, but definitely some major human impacts. We'll leave the 60s out of this discussion, but there's that. Here are a couple more cordyceps. These are some pictures that I took on cicada. And here's the far right one I found out near Rome in the sand. And so there's the little larvae. I saw the sporulating part up here as I was walking around looking for other mushrooms. And if you dig carefully down, if you don't break it off, you'll find this little pocket, and that's where the thing is getting its energy. Okay, so cicadas are kind of annoying. Maybe that's okay, right? There's another cicada cordyceps that recently hit a big splash in the literature. This is not it. I'll get there in a minute. Here's another cordyceps. This one infects actually deer truffles, which are very common in our forests. And if it's a kind of an amber color poking out of the ground, you probably either have Cordyceps militaris, which gets after our insects, or you have Ophioglossaides, which is going after the deer truffle. But they all are interacting below ground. And it's kind of interesting to me that they can sort of make, there's been an evolutionary switch from infecting insects to infecting truffle mushrooms. Both are loaded with chitin. Maybe the resistance interactions are very similar. I don't know. But it's a very closely related pair of fungi on very different hosts. And I think that's intriguing to me because, well, I know it's intriguing to me. I think it's intriguing because it gives some interesting evolutionary storylines that need to be followed up. How can you make such a massive switch from going after an insect to going after a mushroom for your energy? I don't know. Anyway, we have a lot to learn. Here's another, fungus that attacks fungi. So this particular bolete, Boletus parasiticus, only grows on these dark puffballs. They're called scleroderma. This is a picture I took. I find these relatively frequently in our area. And I think it's interesting because here a fungus is attacking a fungus. So as the slide said, it's a fungus eat fungus world out there. Again, that fungus has to somehow evolve down a very specific pathway, and it has to be successful or we won't see it, to go after a particular fungus, which is very common, actually. It's a good idea. These scleroderma species are everywhere out there. So the bolete is actually banking on frequency of the fungus as a success. Okay, by the way, just to be sure we're all on the same page, that was the scleroderma. And if you find these on a log, which you can at Heiberg or other places, and cut them in half, they're black inside. But notice this one is white and black because the bolete hyphae is in there and stealing all the energy. And then that allows the bolete to germinate, or I should say put out a fruit body. Okay, we're still not, I got ahead of myself a little bit. I'll come back to this cordyceps on cicadas in a minute. This is one that I was working in Honduras. Remember the couple sessions ago I was talking about the work with the chytrid on frogs down there I was doing in a PCR lab. Well, one day someone brought this leaf to me and said they found this insect dead on the leaf and wondered what it was. Well, it was a wasp. It is a cordyceps fruiting off the body of that wasp. So the wasp was flying around. It eventually got the notion that it should stop flying, it should go to a leaf or something, clasp on, and hold on for dear death as opposed to dear life. And then the fungus again fruits out and disperses spores down upon other unsuspecting wasps in the area. A lot of these are very poorly known in terms of what species we're looking at in terms of the in terms of the fungus. Here's a couple that are on flies. These are in the genus Entomoptera. Musquet refers to the fly. You can see this one here is posting up on a fence post, right? So it gets up there, it dies, and then the fungus is actually kind of just bursting out of its butt. This is part of the old insect. It used to be connected to this one over here, but now it's got this big hyphal cushion in between. It's also coming out of its eye socket. So this thing is completely infiltrated, if you will, by the fungus. You can, and I have seen images like this on your windows. If you look around, you'll find there's a fly stuck to the window or on the windowsill or something, and all around it is this white powder. Well, that's because the fly, again, flew there, died, stuck itself to that area, or at least was convinced to get there by the fungus, and then the fungus burst out with all these spores, and other flies come visit, and they get infected. I do note that your book called this Entomorpha, but it is Entomoptera, referring to the insect-loving fungi. It's a whole genus that does this. All right. There was our cordyceps from the tropics. Just to show you one more time, I've already told you this story. To move on, this is the one I wanted to talk about, the cicadas. So Kathy Hodge down at Cornell, she's a friend and a colleague. She told this story recently, like within the last 5 years or so. When she was pulling up cicadas, she was finding occasionally that their abdomen were loaded with spores. And in fact, she was finding some cicadas flying around with the back of their abdomen having fallen off, and they were just raining spores as they flew. They sort of lost their normal behavioral pattern. They didn't need the rest of their body because, well, it was all fungus anyway. And not real good for the cicada, but the spores are raining down and affecting other uninfected cicadas and dispersing that way. Recently, they had a paper out to show that the fungus, in addition to just filling up the body as this thing is, well, as the insect isn't quite dying yet, it's using the energy like all these insect-loving fungi do inside the body. It's using all that energy, and instead of the insect getting it, it's going to fungus. It's filling up the body cavity. And it was thought for a while that maybe the last thing that happens is the fungus then penetrates into the brain and causes these behavioral changes, like clasping onto trees, or in this case, just flying around kind of randomly and dropping spores. But what she showed is that there may be something else going on here. They isolated a couple of chemicals. One is very closely related to LSD. Does that alter the behavioral pattern because that stuff gets into the brain and causes the insects to start doing weird things? The other is related to amphetamines. And so they start to fly a lot more sporadically, crazy, a lot more energy in their fly habits to drop spores, supposedly. I talked to her recently about this. I got the paper published, and I said, what do you think? She said, I don't think there's a whole lot of these chemicals that are being produced, and whether it's enough to cause the behavioral changes that we see is another question. But her big, one of the things she said is, it's not enough for humans. I'm like, well, what's she suggesting? Apparently she's had some queries about whether, do we need to watch out for teenagers going around eating cicadas with butts that are broken off like that? Sorry. This is all a fun area for me to think about in terms of what these insects are doing and how we interpret them and what we can utilize, how we could utilize them. Okay, moving on. Let's see. So here is another example of the sort of, why do they go to these upper areas and clasp and drop their spores? Well, obviously it's to disperse the spores. And so this is figure 1518 out of your book. I think the cycle here is figure 1517, if I'm not mistaken. But these uninfected the dung flies will only kind of bop around in the grassy area in the lower areas. And so they're doing their thing. They go to dung, they lay their larvae, and they sometimes go to the upper portions of the grasses, but they don't go up to the taller herbs or trees or anything like that until they get infected. Then, rather than only landing on top of the leaves and grasses, they land and hold on beneath, on the underside of the leaves and the grasses or whatever's up there. So they fly up to higher elevation, and instead of landing on top, they land below, they clasp, they die, and guess what? They're dropping spores and raining down where these guys are all hanging out on top. And so the uninfected flies are getting infected by their brethren and sistren. So here in the figures, you can see the actual data. Perching height on plants, if they're uninfected, quite low, only around 20 centimeters. But when they get infected, they start going up 3 times as high to, say, 60 centimeters. Okay? And the uninfected tend to stay on the upper leaf surfaces, the green bar, but the infected start to only go to the undersides of the leaves where they can drop their spores down on their, again, on their brethren. So a lot of different fungi are doing this. If you start paying attention, you know, I've often walk in the forest, I'm sure you've done this too, and you see a worm or a caterpillar hanging by a thread in the middle of the forest. And you look up and you're like, okay, so it's coming from way up there, but why is it here? I think it's been infected. And in fact, I've actually seen worms hanging like that, caterpillars, I shouldn't say worms, sorry to the entomologists. And presumably, I guess I would suggest that maybe there's something inside that thing and it tried to escape and it's just sitting out there. But I saw a wasp come in, land, start poking its little butt in there and drop probably some parasitoid eggs so that whatever was in that thing as it grew up was then going to get infected by the parasitoid wasp. And I'll show you an example of this in a minute. But those, you know, that's not a normal habit, but you see it all the time. And that is probably a parasite on those caterpillars, causing them to drop like that. More behavioral changes. So here we have these little isopods. They live in the water. When they're parasitized, they tend to they tend to not stay undercover. Right? Only about 20% stay undercover, whether there's 0, 1, or 2 fish. If they're non-parasitized, they don't do that. They stay undercover, right? Those that haven't been infected, those isopods stay undercover, no matter how many fish are in the area. So what's the difference? Well, these guys have been parasitized. They go out, well, 80% of them go out away from the rocks or whatever shelter they're in, and they get picked off by the fish. Probably this is a dispersal mechanism for that particular parasite of the isopods. Okay, so that brings us to a close of this portion. We're going to get into some more examples in a minute or in the next segment and some more data. Those are mostly just kind of what one of my professors used to call Uncle Wiggily stories. So you're like, this is just like, well, Dad, why do you have to tell me this? I don't want to know. That's what my kids will sometimes say. The other version of that is, Dad, no one cares. But anyway, I'm fine with that. So that's it for this segment. We'll see you next time. And